Louisiana, its discovery and vicissitudes. Louisiana and its eventful history, the Expedition of De Soto. The Missionary, Marquette, his voyage on the upper Mississippi, the Expedition of Salle, Michilimackinac, its history, fate of the Griffin, grief of Salle, his voyage of discovery, sale of Louisiana to the United States, remarks of Napoleon. The transfer of Louisiana to the United States is one of the most interesting events in the history of our country. In the year 1800, Spain, then in possession of the vast region west of the Mississippi, ceded it to France. The whole country west of the majestic river, appropriately called the Father of Waters, was then called Louisiana, and its boundaries were very obscurely defined. Indeed, neither the missionary nor the hunter had penetrated but a very short distance into those unknown wilds. It was in the year 1541 that De Soto, marching from Florida across the country, came to the banks of this magnificent river near the present site of Memphis. He knew not where it took its rise or where it emptied its swollen flood, but he found a stream more than a mile in width of almost fathomless depth, rolling its rapid, turbid stream on which were floated innumerable logs and trees, through an almost uninhabited country of wonderful luxuriance. He was in search of gold, and crossing the river, advanced in a northwesterly direction about 200 miles, till he came within sight of the highlands of the White River. He then turned in a southerly direction and continued his explorations, till death soon terminated his melancholy career. More than 130 years passed over these solitudes, when James Marquette, a French missionary among the Indians at St. Mary's, the outlet of Lake Superior, resolved to explore the Mississippi, of whose magnificence he had heard much from the lips of the Indians, who had occasionally extended their hunting tour to its banks. He was inured to all the hardships of the wilderness, seemed to despise worldly comforts, and had a soul of bravery which could apparently set all perils at defiance. And still he was endued with a poetic nature which reveled in the charms of these wild and romantic realms as he climbed its mountains and floated in his canoe over its silent and placid streams. Even then it was not known whether the Mississippi emptied its majestic flood into the Pacific Ocean or into the Gulf of Mexico. The foot of the white man upon the shores of Lake Superior had never penetrated beyond the Indian village, where the Fox River enters into Green Bay. From this point, Marquette started for the exploration of the Mississippi. The party consisted of Mr. Marquette, a French gentleman by the name of Joliet, 5 French voyageurs, and 2 Indian guides. They transported their 2 birch canoes on their shoulders across the portage from the Fox River to the Wisconsin River. Paddling rapidly down this stream through realms of silence and solitude, they soon entered the majestic Mississippi, more than 1,500 miles above its mouth. Marquette seems to have experienced in the highest degree the romance of his wonderful voyage, for he says that he commenced the descent of the mighty river with a joy that could not be expressed. It was the beautiful month of June, 1673, the most genial season of the year. The skies were bright above them. The placid stream was fringed with banks of wonderful luxuriance and beauty, the rocky cliffs at times assuming the aspect of majestic castles of every variety of architecture. Again, the gently swelling hills were robed in sublime forests, and again the smooth meadows in their verdure spread far away to the horizon. Rapidly the canoes, gently guided by the paddles, floated down the stream. Having descended the river about 180 miles, they came to a very well-trod Indian trail leading back from the river into the interior. Marquette and Joliet had the curiosity and the courage to follow this trail for 6 miles, until they came to an Indian village. It would seem that some of the Indians there in their hunting excursions had wandered to some of the French settlements, for 4 of their leading men, dressed in the most gorgeous display of barbaric pomp, brilliant with many colored plumes, came out to meet them and conducted them to the cabin of their chief. He addressed them in the following words: "How beautiful is the sun, Frenchman, when thou comest to visit us! Our whole village welcomes thee. In peace thou shalt enter all our dwellings." After a very pleasant visit, they returned to their boats and resumed their voyage. They floated by the mouth of the turbid Missouri, little dreaming of the grandeur of the realms watered by that imperial stream and its tributaries. They passed the mouth of the Ohio, which they recognized as the Belle Riviere, which the Indians then called the Wabash. As they floated rapidly away towards the south, they visited many Indian villages on the banks of the stream, where the devoted missionary Marquette endeavored to proclaim the gospel of Christ. "I did not," says Marquette, "fear death. I should have esteemed it the greatest happiness to have died for the glory of God." Thus they continued their exploration as far south as the mouth of the Arkansas River, where they were hospitably received in a very flourishing Indian village. Being now satisfied that the Mississippi River entered the Gulf of Mexico, somewhere between Florida and California, they returned to Green Bay by the route of the Illinois River. By taking advantage of the eddies on either side of the stream, it was not difficult for them in their light canoes to make the ascent. Marquette landed on the western banks of Lake Michigan to preach the gospel to a tribe of Indians called the Mayams, residing near the present site of Chicago. Joliet returned to Quebec to announce the result of their discoveries. He was received with great rejoicing. The whole population flocked to the cathedral where the Te Deum was sung. 5 years passed away, during which the great river flowed almost unthought of through its vast and somber wilderness. At length in the year 1678, La Salle received a commission from Louis XI of France to explore the Mississippi to its mouth. Having received from the king the command of Fort Frontenac, at the northern extremity of Lake Ontario, and a monopoly of the fur trade in all the countries he should discover, he sailed from La Rochelle in a ship well armed and abundantly supplied in June 1678. Ascending the St. Lawrence to Quebec, he repaired to Fort Frontenac. With a large number of men he paddled in birch canoes to the southern extremity of Lake Ontario, and by a portage around the Falls of Niagara, entered Lake Erie. Here he built a substantial vessel called the Griffin, which was the first vessel ever launched upon the waters of that lake. Embarking in this vessel with 40 men in the month of September, a genial and gorgeous month in those latitudes, he traversed with favoring breezes the whole length of the lake, a voyage of 265 miles, ascended the straits and passed through the Lake of St. Clair and ran along the coast of Lake Huron 360 miles to Michilimackinac, where the three majestic lakes, Superior, Michigan, and Huron, form a junction. Here a trading post was established, which subsequently attained worldwide renown, and to which the Indians flocked with their furs from almost boundless realms. Mr. Schoolcraft, who some years after visited this romantic spot, gives the following interesting account of the scenery and strange life witnessed there. As these phases of human life have now passed away, never to be renewed, it seems important that the memory of them should be perpetuated. Nothing can present a more picturesque and refreshing spectacle to the traveler, wearied with the lifeless monotony of a voyage through Lake Huron, than the first sight of the island of Michilimackinac, which rises from the watery horizon in lofty bluffs imprinting a rugged outline along the sky, and capped with a fortress on which the American flag is seen waving against the blue heavens. The name is a compound of the word Misril, signifying great, and Mackinac, the Indian word for turtle, from a fancied resemblance of the island to a great turtle lying upon the water. It is a spot of much interest, aside from its romantic beauty, in consequence of its historical associations and natural curiosities. It is 9 miles in circumference, and its extreme elevation above the lake is over 300 feet. The town is pleasantly situated around a small bay at the southern extremity of the island and contains a few hundred souls, which are sometimes swelled to 1,000 or 2,000 by the influx of voyageurs, traders, and Indians. On these occasions, its beautiful harbor is seen checkered with American vessels at anchor and Indian canoes rapidly shooting across the water in every direction. It was formerly the seat of an extensive fur trade. At present it is noted for the great amount of trout and white fish annually exported. Fort Mackinac stood on a rocky bluff overlooking the town. The ruins of Fort Holmes are on the apex of the island. It was built by the British in the War of 1812 under the name of Fort George, and was changed to its present appellation after the surrender to the Americans, in compliment to the memory of Major Holmes, who fell in the attack upon the island. The old town of Michilimackinac stood at the extreme point of the peninsula of Michigan, 9 miles south of the island. 8 years before La Salle's expedition, Father Marquette, the French missionary, visited this spot with a party of Hurons, upon whom he prevailed to locate themselves. A fort was soon constructed and became an important post. It continued to be the seat of the fur trade, and the undisturbed rendezvous of the Indian tribes during the whole period that the French exercised dominion over the Canadas. Here at Michilimackinac, La Salle purchased a rich cargo of furs, exchanging for them his goods at an immense profit. The Griffin, laden with wealth, set out on her return and was wrecked by the way with total loss. La Salle with his companions had embarked in birch canoes, and descending Lake Michigan to near its southern extremity, they landed and erected a fort which they called Miami's. They then carried their canoes across to the Illinois River and paddled down that stream until they came near to the present site of Peoria, where they established another fort, which La Salle, grief-stricken in view of his loss, named Crèvecoeur or Heartsore. Here the energetic and courageous adventurer left his men in winter quarters, while with but 3 companions he traversed the wilderness on foot, amidst the snows of winter, to Fort Frontenac, a distance of 1,500 miles. After an absence of several weeks, he returned with additional men and the means of building a large and substantial flat-bottomed boat, with which to descend the Illinois River to the Mississippi, and the latter stream to its mouth. The romantic achievement was successfully accomplished. The banners of France were unfurled along the banks of the majestic river and upon the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. This whole region, which France claimed by the right of discovery, was named in honor of the King of France, Louisiana. Its limits were necessarily quite undefined. In 1684, a French colony of 280 persons was sent out to effect a settlement on the lower Mississippi. Passing by the mouth of the river without discovering it, they landed in Texas and took possession of the country in the name of the King of France. Disaster followed disaster. Salle died and the colonists were exterminated by the Indians. Not long after this, all the country west of the Mississippi was ceded by France to Spain, and again, some years after, was surrendered back again by Spain to France. We have not space here to allude to the details of these varied transactions. But this comprehensive record seems to be essential to the full understanding of the narrative upon which we have entered. It was in the year 1763 that Louisiana was ceded by France to Spain. In the year 1800, it was yielded back to France under Napoleon by a secret article in the Treaty of Saint Ildefonso. It had now become a matter of infinite moment to the United States that the great republic should have undisputed command of the Mississippi, from its source to its mouth. President Jefferson instructed our minister at Paris, Robert Livingston, to negotiate with the French government for the purchase of Louisiana. France was then at war with England. The British fleet swept triumphantly all the seas. Napoleon, conscious that he could not protect Louisiana from British arms, consented to the sale. We are informed that on the 10th of April, 1803, he summoned two of his ministers in council and said to them, "I am fully sensible of the value of Louisiana, and it was my wish to repair the error of the French diplomatists who abandoned it in 1763. I have scarcely recovered it before I run the risk of losing it, but if I am obliged to give it up, it shall cost more to those who force me to part with it than to those to whom I yield it. The English have despoiled France of all her northern possessions in America, and now they covet those of the South. I am determined that they shall not have the Mississippi. Although Louisiana is but a trifle compared with their vast possessions in other parts of the globe, yet, judging from the vexation they have manifested on seeing it return to the power of France, I am certain that their first object will be to obtain possession of it. They will probably commence the war in that quarter. They have 20 vessels in the Gulf of Mexico, and our affairs in St. Domingo are daily getting worse since the death of Leclerc. The conquest of Louisiana might be easily made, and I have not a moment to lose in putting it out of their reach. I am not sure but that they have already begun an attack upon it. Such a measure would be in accordance with their habits, and in their place I should not wait. I am inclined, in order to deprive them of all prospect of ever possessing it, to cede it to the United States. Indeed, I can hardly say I cede it, for I do not yet possess it. And if I wait but a short time, my enemies may leave me nothing but an empty title to grant to the republic I wish to conciliate. They only ask for one city of Louisiana, but I consider the whole colony as lost. And I believe that in the hands of this rising power, it will be more useful to the political and even the commercial interests of France than if I should attempt to retain it. Let me have both of your opinions upon this subject." One of the ministers, Barbe Marbois, cordially approved of the plan of cession. The other opposed it. After long deliberation, the conference was closed without Napoleon making known his decision. The next day he sent for Barbe Marbois and said to him, "The season for deliberation is over. I have determined to part with Louisiana. I shall give up not only New Orleans but the whole colony without reservation. That I do not undervalue Louisiana I have sufficiently proved, as the object of my first treaty with Spain was to recover it. But though I regret parting with it, I am convinced that it would be folly to persist in trying to keep it. I commission you, therefore, to negotiate this affair with the envoys of the United States. Do not wait the arrival of Mr. Monroe, but go this very day and confer with Mr. Livingston. Remember, however, that I need ample funds for carrying on the war, and I do not wish to commence it by levying new taxes. During the last century, France and Spain have incurred great expense in the improvement of Louisiana, for which her trade has never indemnified them. Large sums have been advanced to different companies which have never returned to the treasury. It is fair that I should require payment for these. Were I to regulate my demands by the importance of this territory to the United States, they would be unbounded. But being obliged to part with it, I shall be moderate in my terms. Still, remember I must have 50 millions of francs, 10 million, and I will not consent to take less. I would rather make some desperate effort to preserve this fine country." Negotiations commenced that day. Soon Mr. Monroe arrived. On the 30th of April, 1803, the treaty was signed, the United States paying $15 million for the entire territory. It was stipulated by Napoleon that Louisiana should be, as soon as possible, incorporated into the Union, and that its inhabitants should enjoy the same rights, privileges, and immunities as other citizens of the United States. The third article of the treaty, securing to them these benefits, was drawn up by Napoleon himself. He presented it to the plenipotentiaries with these words: "Make it known to the people of Louisiana that we regret to part with them, that we have stipulated for all the advantages they could desire, and that France, in giving them up, has ensured to them the greatest of all. They could never have prospered under any European government, as they will when they become independent. But while they enjoy the privileges of liberty, let them ever remember that they are French, and preserve for their mother country that affection which a common origin inspires." This purchase was an immense acquisition to the United States. "I consider," said Mr. Livingston, "that from this day the United States take rank with the first powers of Europe, and now she has entirely escaped from the power of England." Napoleon was also well pleased with the transaction. "By this cession," he said, "I have secured the power of the United States and given to England a maritime rival, who at some future time will humble her pride." The boundaries of this unexampled purchase could not be clearly defined. There was not any known landmarks to which reference could be made. The United States thus had the sole claim to the vast territory west of the Mississippi, extending on the north through Oregon to the Pacific Ocean and on the south to the Mexican dominions. From the day of the transfer, the natural resources of the Great Valley of the Mississippi began to be rapidly developed. The accompanying map will enable the reader more fully to understand the geography of the above narrative. Camp life beyond the Alleghenies. John Finley and his adventures aspect of the country. Boone's private character, his love for the wilderness, first view of Kentucky emigrants, dress hunters, home capture of Boone and Stewart by the Indians there, escape. Singular incident. In the year 1767, a bold hunter by the name of John Finley with 2 or 3 companions crossed the mountain range of the Alleghenies into the region beyond, now known as Kentucky. The mountains where he crossed, consisting of a series of parallel ridges, some of which were quite impassable save at particular points, presented a rugged expanse nearly 50 miles in breadth. It took many weary days for these moccasined feet to traverse the wild solitudes. The Indian avoids the mountains. He chooses the smooth prairie where the buffalo and the elk graze, and where the wild turkey, the grouse, and the prairie chicken wing their flight, or the banks of some placid stream over which he can glide in his birch canoe, and where fish of every variety can be taken. Indeed, the Indians, with an eye for picturesque beauty, seldom reared their villages in the forest, whose glooms repelled them. Generally, where the forest approached the stream, they clustered their wigwams in its edge, with the tranquil river and the open country spread out before them. John Finley and his companions traversed the broad expanse of the Alleghenies without meeting any signs of human life. The extreme western ridge of these parallel eminences or spurs has received the name of the Cumberland Mountains. Passing through a gorge which has since then become renowned in peace and war as Cumberland Gap, they entered upon a vast undulating expanse of wonderful fertility and beauty. In its rivers, its plains, its forests, its gentle eminences, its bright skies and salubrious clime, it presented then as now as attractive a residence for man as this globe can furnish. Finley and his companions spent several months roving through this, to them, New Eden. Game of every variety abounded. Through some inexplicable reason, no Indians held possession of the country, but wandering tribes whose homes and acknowledged territory were far away in the north, the west, and the south were ever traversing these regions in hunting bands. They often met in bloody encounters. These conflicts were so frequent and so sanguinary that this realm, so highly favored of God for the promotion of all happiness, subsequently received the appropriate name of the Dark and Bloody Ground. After an absence of many months, Finley and his companions returned to North Carolina with the most glowing accounts of the new country which they had found. Their story of the beauty of those realms was so extravagant that many regarded them as gross exaggerations. It subsequently appeared, however, that they were essentially true. A more lovely and attractive region cannot be found on earth. It is man's inhumanity to man, mainly, which has ever caused such countless millions to mourn. Daniel Boone listened eagerly to the recital of John Finley and his associates. The story they told added fuel to the flame of emigration, which was already consuming him. He talked more and more earnestly of his desire to cross the mountains. We know not what were the emotions with which his wife was agitated, in view of her husband's increasing desire for another plunge into the wilderness. We simply know that through her whole career, she manifested the most tender solicitude to accommodate herself to the wishes of her beloved husband. Indeed, he was a man peculiarly calculated to win a noble woman's love. Gentle in his demeanor, and in all his utterances mild and affectionate in his intercourse with his family, he seemed quite unconscious of the heroism he manifested in those achievements, which gave him ever-increasing renown. Life in the cabin of the frontiersman, where the wants are few and the supplies abundant, is comparatively a leisure life. These men knew but little of the hurry and the bustle with which those in the crowded city engaged daily in the almost deadly struggle for bread. There was no want in the cabin of Daniel Boone. As these two hardy adventurers, John Finley and Daniel Boone, sat together hour after hour by the fire, talking of the new country which Finley had explored, the hearts of both burned within them again to penetrate those remote realms. To them there were no hardships in the journey. At the close of each day's march, which but slightly wearied their toughened sinews, they could in a few moments throw up a shelter, beneath which they would enjoy more luxurious sleep than the traveler, after being rocked in the rail cars, can now find on the softest couches of our metropolitan hotels. And the dainty morsel cut with artistic skill from the fat buffalo, and toasted on the end of a ramrod before the campfire, possessed a relish which few epicures have ever experienced at the most sumptuous tables in Paris or New York. And as these men seemed to have been constitutionally devoid of any emotions of fear from wild beasts, or still wilder Indians, the idea of a journey of a few hundred miles in the wilderness was not one to be regarded by them with any special solicitude. Gradually they formed a plan for organizing a small party to traverse these beautiful realms in search of a new home. A company of 6 picked men was formed, and Daniel Boone was chosen their leader. The names of this party were John Finley, John Stewart, Joseph Holden, James Monsey, and William Cool. A journey of many hundred miles was before them. Through the vast mountain barrier, which could only be traversed by circuitous wanderings some hundreds of miles in extent, their route was utterly pathless, and there were many broad and rapid streams to be crossed, which flowed through the valleys between the mountain ridges. Though provision in abundance was scattered along the way, strong clothing must be provided, powder and bullets they must take with them, and all these necessaries were to be carried upon their backs, for no pack horses could thread the defiles of the mountains or climb their rugged cliffs. It was also necessary to make provision for the support of the families of these adventurers during their absence of many months. It does not appear that Mrs. Boone presented any obstacle in the way of her husband's embarking in this adventure. Her sons were old enough to assist her in the management of the farm, and game was still to be found in profusion in the silent prairies and sublime forests which surrounded them. In the sunny clime of North Carolina, May comes with all the balminess and soft zephyrs of a more northern summer. It was a beautiful morning on the first day of May, 1769, when Boone and his companions commenced their adventurous journey. In the brief narrative which Boone has given of this excursion, we perceive that it was with some considerable regret that he separated himself from his much-loved wife and children on the peaceful banks of the Yadkin. We must infer that the first part of their journey was fatiguing, for it took them a full month to accomplish the passage of the mountains. Though it was less than 100 miles across these ridges in a direct line, the circuitous route which it was necessary to take greatly lengthened the distance. And as they were never in a hurry, they would be very likely, when coming to one of the many lovely valleys on the banks of the Holstein or the Clinch River, to be enticed to some days of delay. Where now there are thriving villages filled with the hum of the industries of a high civilization, there was then but the solitary landscape dotted with herds of buffalo and of deer. Boone says that in many of these regions he found buffalo roving in companies of several hundreds, feeding upon the tender leaves of the canebrake, or browsing upon the smooth and extended meadows. Being far removed from the usual route of the Indian hunters, they were very tame, manifesting no fear at the approach of man. On the 7th of June, our adventurers, at the close of a day of arduous travel, reached an eminence of the Cumberland Mountains, which gave them a commanding and an almost entrancing view of the region beyond, now known as the state of Kentucky. At the height upon which they stood, the expanse spreading out to the west, until lost in the distant horizon, presented an aspect of nature's loveliness such as few eyes have ever beheld. The sun was brilliantly sinking, accompanied by a gorgeous retinue of clouds. Majestic forests, widespread prairies, and lakes and rivers, gilded by the setting sun, confirmed the truth of the most glowing reports which had been heard from the lips of Finley. An artist has seized upon this incident, which he has transferred to canvas in a picture which he has entitled Daniel Boone's First View of Kentucky. Engravings have been so multiplied of this painting that it has become familiar to most eyes. The appearance of our adventurers is thus graphically described by Mr. Peck in his excellent Life of Daniel Boone. Their dress was of the description usually worn at that period by all forest rangers. The outside garment was a hunting shirt or loose open frock made of dressed deerskins. Leggings or drawers of the same material covered the lower extremities, to which was appended a pair of moccasins for the feet. The cape or collar of the hunting shirt and the seams of the leggings were adorned with fringes. The undergarments were of coarse cotton. A leather belt encircled the body. On the right side was suspended the tomahawk to be used as a hatchet. On the left was the hunting knife, powder horn, bullet pouch, and other appendages indispensable for a hunter. Each person bore his trusty rifle, and as the party made its toilsome way amid the shrubs, and over the logs and loose shrubs that accident had thrown upon the obscure trail they were following, each man gave a sharp lookout as though danger or a lurking enemy were near. Their garments were soiled and rent, the unavoidable result of long travel and exposure to the heavy rains which had fallen, the weather having been stormy and uncomfortable, and they had traversed a mountainous wilderness for several hundred miles. The leader of the party was of full size, with a hardy, robust, sinewy frame and keen, piercing hazel eyes that glanced with quickness at every object as they passed on, now cast forward in the direction they were traveling for signs of an old trail, and in the next moment directed askance into the dense forest or the deep ravine, as if watching some concealed enemy. The reader will recognize in this man the pioneer Boone at the head of his companions. The peculiar character of these men is developed in the fact that rapidly descending the western declivity of the mountains, they came to a beautiful meadow upon the banks of a little stream now called Red River. Here they reared their hut, and here they remained in apparently luxurious idleness all the summer, and here Daniel Boone remained all of the ensuing winter. Their object could scarcely have been to obtain furs, for they could not transport them across the mountains. There were in the vicinity quite a number of salt springs which the animals of the forest frequented in immense numbers. In the brief account which Boone gives of these long months, he simply says, "In this forest, the habitation of beasts of every kind natural to America, we practiced hunting with great success until the 22nd day of December following. Bears, buffalo, and deer were mainly the large game which fell before their rifles. Waterfowl and also land birds of almost every variety were found in great profusion." It must have been a strange life which these 6 men experienced during these 7 months in the camp on the silent waters of the Red River. No Indians were seen, and no traces of them were discovered through this period. The hunters made several long excursions in various directions, apparently examining the country in reference to their own final settlement in it and to the introduction of emigrants from the Atlantic border. Indeed, it has been said that Daniel Boone was the secret agent of a company on the other side of the mountains, who wished to obtain possession of a large extent of territory for the formation of a colony there. But of this nothing with certainty is known, yet there must have been some strong controlling motive to have induced these men to remain so long in their camp, which consisted simply of a shed of logs on the banks of this solitary stream. 3 sides of the hut were enclosed. The interstices between the logs were filled with moss or clay. The roof was also carefully covered with bark so as to be impervious to rain. The floor was spread over with dry leaves and with the fragrant twigs of the hemlock, presenting a very inviting couch for the repose of weary men. The skins of buffaloes and of bears presented ample covering for their night's repose. The front of the hut facing the south was entirely open, before which blazed their campfire. Here the men seemed to have been very happy. The climate was mild, they were friendly to each other, they had good health, and abundance of food was found in their camp. On the 22nd of December, Boone, with one of his companions, John Stewart, set out on one of their exploring tour. There were parts of the country called cane brakes, covered with cane growing so thickly together as to be quite impenetrable to the hunter. Through portions of these the buffaloes had trampled their way in large companies, one following another, opening paths called streets. These streets had apparently been trodden for ages. Following these paths, Boone and his companion had advanced several miles from their camp, when suddenly a large party of Indians sprang from their concealment and seized them both as captives. The action was so sudden that there was no possibility of resistance. In the following words Boone describes this event: "This day John Stewart and I had a pleasing ramble, but fortune changed the scene in the close of it. We had passed through a great forest, on which stood myriads of trees, some gay with blossoms, others rich with fruits. Nature was here a series of wonders and a fund of delight. Here she displayed her ingenuity and industry in a variety of flowers and fruits, beautifully colored, elegantly shaped, and charmingly flavored, and we were diverted with innumerable animals presenting themselves perpetually to our view. In the decline of the day, near Kentucky River, as we ascended the brow of a small hill, a number of Indians rushed out upon us from a thick canebrake and made us prisoners. The time of our sorrow was now arrived. They plundered us of what we had and kept us in confinement 7 days, treating us with common savage usage. The peculiar character of Boone was here remarkably developed. His whole course of life had made him familiar with the manners and customs of the Indians. They were armed only with bows and arrows. He had the death-dealing rifle which they knew not how to use. His placid temper was never ruffled by elation in prosperity or despair in adversity. He assumed perfect contentment with his lot, cultivated friendly relations with them, taught them many things they did not know, and aided them in all the ways in his power. His rifle ball would instantly strike down the buffalo, when the arrow of the Indian would only goad him to frantic flight. The Indians admired the courage of their captive, appreciated his skill, and began to regard him as a friend and a helper. They relaxed their vigilance, while every day they were leading their prisoners far away from their camp into the boundless West. Boone was so well acquainted with the Indian character as to be well aware that any attempt to escape, if unsuccessful, would cause his immediate death. The Indians, exasperated by what they would deem such an insult to their hospitality, would immediately bury the tomahawk in his brain. Thus 7 days and nights passed away. At the close of each day's travel, the Indians selected some attractive spot for the night's encampment or bivouac, according to the state of the weather, near some spring or stream. Here they built a rousing fire, roasted choice cuts from the game they had taken, and feasted abundantly with jokes and laughter and many boastful stories of their achievements. They then threw themselves upon the ground for sleep, though someone was appointed to keep a watch over their captives. But deceived by the entire contentment and friendliness, feigned by Boone and by Stuart, who implicitly followed the counsel of his leader's superior mind, all thoughts of any attempt of their captives to escape soon ceased to influence the savages. On the 7th night after the capture, the Indians, gorged with an abundant feast, were all soundly asleep. It was midnight. The flickering fire burned feebly. The night was dark. They were in the midst of an apparently boundless forest. The favorable hour for an attempt to escape had come, but it was full of peril. Failure was certain death, for the Indians deemed it one of the greatest of all crimes for a captive who had been treated with kindness to attempt to escape. A group of fierce savages were sleeping around, each one of whom, accustomed to midnight alarms, was supposed to sleep, to use an expressive phrase, with one eye open. Boone, who had feigned sound slumber, cautiously awoke his companion who was asleep and motioned him to follow. The rustling of a leaf, the crackling of a twig, would instantly cause every savage to grasp his bow and arrow and spring from the ground. Fortunately, the Indians had allowed their captives to retain their guns, which had proved so valuable in obtaining game. With step as light as the fall of a feather, these men with moccasined feet crept from the encampment. After a few moments of intense solicitude, they found themselves in the impenetrable gloom of the forest, and their captors still undisturbed. With vastly superior native powers to the Indian and equally accustomed to forest life, Boone was in all respects their superior. With the instinct of the bee, he made a straight line towards the encampment they had left, with the locality of which the Indians were not acquainted. The peril which menaced them added wings to their flight. It was midwinter, and though not very cold in that climate, fortunately for them, the December nights were long. 6 precious hours would pass before the dawn of the morning would struggle through the treetops. Till then, the bewildered Indians could obtain no clue whatever to the direction of their flight. Carefully guarding against leaving any traces of their footsteps behind them, and watching with an eagle eye lest they should encounter any other band of savages, they pressed forward hour after hour with sinews apparently as tireless as if they had been wrought of iron. When the fugitives reached their camp, they found it plundered and deserted. Whether the red men had discovered it and carried off their companions as prisoners, or whether the white men in a panic had destroyed what they could not remove and had attempted a retreat to the settlements, was never known. It is probable that in some way they perished in the wilderness, and that their fate is to be added to the thousands of tragedies occurring in this world which no pen has recorded. The intrepid Boone and his companion Stuart seemed, however, to have no idea of abandoning their encampment. But apprehensive that the Indians might have discovered their retreat, they reared a small hut in another spot, still more secret and secure. It is difficult to imagine what motive could have led these 2 men to remain any longer in these solitudes, 500 miles from home, exposed to so many privations and to such fearful peril. Notwithstanding the utmost care in husbanding their resources, their powder and lead were rapidly disappearing, and there was no more to be obtained in the wilderness. But here they remained a month, doing apparently nothing but living luxuriously, according to their ideas of good cheer. The explanation is probably to be found in the fascination of this life of a hunter, which once enjoyed seems almost irresistible, even to those accustomed to all the appliances of a high civilization. A gentleman from New York who spent a winter among the wild scenes of the Rocky Mountains describes in the following graphic language the effect of these scenes upon his own mind. When I turned my horse's head from Pike's Peak, I quite regretted the abandonment of my mountain life, solitary as it was, and more than once thought of again taking the trail to the Salado Valley, where I enjoyed such good sport. Apart from the feeling of loneliness, which anyone in my situation must naturally have experienced, surrounded by the stupendous works of nature, which in all their solitary grandeur frowned upon me, there was something inexpressibly exhilarating in the sensation of positive freedom from all worldly care, and a consequent expansion of the sinews, as it were, of mind and body, which made me feel elastic as a ball of India rubber, and in such a state of perfect ease, that no more dread of scalping Indians entered my mind than if I had been sitting in Broadway in one of the windows of the Astor House. A citizen of the world, I never found any difficulty in investing my resting place wherever it might be with the attributes of a home. Although liable to the accusation of barbarism, I must confess that the very happiest moments of my life have been spent in the wilderness of the far west. I never recall but with pleasure the remembrance of my solitary camp in the Bayou Salado, with no friend near me more faithful than my rifle. With a plentiful supply of dry pine logs on the fire, and its cheerful blaze streaming far up into the sky, illuminating the valley far and near, I would sit enjoying the genial warmth, and watch the blue smoke as it curled upward, building castles in its vapory wreaths. Scarcely did I ever wish to change such hours of freedom for all the luxuries of civilized life. And unnatural and extraordinary as it may appear, yet such are the fascinations of the life of the mountain hunter, that I believe that not one instance could be adduced of even the most polished and civilized of men, who had once tasted the sweets of its attendant liberty, and freedom from every worldly care, not regretting to exchange them for the monotonous life of the settlements, and not sighing and sighing again for its pleasures and allurements. A hunter's camp in the Rocky Mountains is quite a picture. It is invariably made in a picturesque locality, for like the Indian, the white hunter has an eye to the beautiful. Nothing can be more social and cheering than the welcome blaze of the campfire on a cold winter's night, and nothing more amusing or entertaining, if not instructive, than the rough conversation of the simple-minded mountaineers, whose nearly daily task is all of exciting adventure, since their whole existence is spent in scenes of peril and privation. Consequently, the narration is a tale of thrilling accidents and hairbreadth escapes, which, though simple matter-of-fact to them, appears a startling romance to those unacquainted with the lives led by those men, who, with the sky for a roof and their rifles to supply them with food and clothing, call no man lord or master and are as free as the game they follow. There are many events which occurred in the lives of Boone and his companions, which would seem absolutely incredible were they not sustained by evidence beyond dispute. Boone and Stewart were in a boundless, pathless wilderness of forests, mountains, rivers, and lakes. Their camp could not be reached from the settlements, but by a journey of many weeks, apparently without the smallest clue to its location. And yet the younger brother of Boone, upon whom had been conferred his father's singular baptismal name of Squire, set out with a companion to cross the mountains in search of Daniel. One day in the latter part of January, Boone and Stewart were quite alarmed in seeing two men approach their camp. They supposed, of course, that they were Indians and that they were probably followed by a numerous band. Escape was impossible. Captivity and death seemed certain. But to their surprise and delight, the two strangers proved to be white men, one the brother of Daniel Boone and the other a North Carolinian who had accompanied him. They brought with them quite a supply of powder and lead, inestimable treasures in the remote wilderness. Daniel, in his autobiography in the following simple strain, alludes to this extraordinary occurrence. About this time my brother Squire Boone, with another adventurer who came to explore the country shortly after us, was wandering through the forest, determined to find me if possible, and accidentally found our camp. Notwithstanding the unfortunate circumstances of our company, and our dangerous situation as surrounded by hostile savages, our meeting so fortunately in the wilderness made us reciprocally sensible of the utmost satisfaction. So much does friendship triumph over misfortune, that sorrows and sufferings vanish at the meeting, not only of real friends, but of the most distant acquaintances, and substitute happiness in their room. Our hardy pioneer, far more familiar with his rifle than his pen, comments as follows on their condition. We were in a helpless, dangerous situation, exposed daily to perils and death among savages and wild beasts, not a white man in the country but ourselves. Thus situated many hundred miles from our families in the howling wilderness, I believe few would have equally enjoyed the happiness we experienced. I often observe to my brother, you see how little nature requires to be satisfied. Felicity, the companion of content, is rather found in our own breasts than in the enjoyment of external things, and I firmly believe it requires but a little philosophy to make a man happy in whatsoever state he is. This consists in a full resignation to the will of Providence, and a resigned soul finds pleasure in a path strewed with briars and thorns. Indian Warfare. Allegheny Ridge's Voyage in a Canoe Speech of Logan Battle at the Kanawha. Narrative of Francis Marion Important Commission of Boone Council at Circleville Treaty of Peace. Imlay's description of Kentucky settlement, Wright Richard Henderson Boone's letter fort at Boonesboro. The valley of the Clinch River is but one of the many magnificent ravines amid the gigantic ranges of the Allegheny Mountains. Boone, speaking of these ridges which he so often had occasion to cross, says, "These mountains in the wilderness, as we pass from the old settlements in Virginia to Kentucky, are ranged in a southwest and northeast direction and are of great length and breadth and not far distant from each other. Over them nature hath formed passes that are less difficult than might be expected from a view of such huge piles. The aspect of these cliffs is so wild and horrid that it is impossible to behold them without terror." The spectator is apt to imagine that nature has formerly suffered some violent convulsion, and that these are the dismembered remains of the dreadful shock. One cannot but regret that no memorials are left of a wonderful journey, full of romantic interest and exciting adventure, which Boone at one time took to the falls of the Ohio to warn some surveyors of their danger. He reached them in safety, rescued them from certain death, and conducted them triumphantly back to the settlements. So long as the white men with their rifles could keep upon the open prairie, they could defend themselves from almost any number of Indians, who could only assail them with bows and arrows. But the moment they entered the forest or any ravine among the hills, the little band was liable to hear the war whoop of 1,000 Indian braves in the ambush around, and to be assailed by a storm of arrows and javelins from unseen hands.